It's my pleasure to welcome you here to this afternoon seminar mathematics session of the celebration of the 80th anniversary of the Institute for Advanced Study. Our first speaker, John Milnor, is John Milnor. John was a professor here during the 1970s and 80s in the School of Math before moving to Stony, Brook, where he is still located today. He is well known and recognized for his brilliant work solving long-standing problems and introducing novel techniques in many fields of mathematics. Excuse me. Like Weil before him, his theorems and insights have shaped the fields that he has thought about deeply. And there are many such fields, like Weil, and these include, for example, topology, geometry, algebraic geometry, differential geometry, algebra, more recently dynamics. His books are masterpieces of clear exposition and are the standard text from which each new generation of mathematician learns chunks of modern mathematics. I learned from his Morse theory. I learned pretty much all I know about Riemannian geometry in the 20 beautiful pages there called a rapid course, where he touches on all the critical issues. He's of course been recognized with all the prestigious prizes in mathematics and outside, ranging from the Fields Medal to the National Medal of Science. So it's a very appropriate person to start our 80th celebration. It's a great pleasure to have John speak, and his title is Geometry and Growth of Form, Commentary on Darcy Thompson. Thank you.
Let's see, sounds good. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here again and to see so many familiar faces. And it's a great honor to start this celebration. So this will be a commentary on a book called On Growth and Form, first published more than 90 years ago. And this is a picture of the author, Darcy Thompson. So it's an amazing book which, well, the two words growth and form say a great deal about what it's about. Form, I would say, is what we usually call shape in mathematics. So he's studying the way that the shape of organism changes as they grow, but also the way that the shape changes in the course of evolution. And it's a book which is still alive after so many years, I think in good part because it has very little in the way of theory. It's just full of examples and questions. And, well, I won't give you a book full of examples and questions, but I certainly will try to provide some examples and some questions. So in one of his many chapters, he just compared the shapes of different species. So for example, here is an example of comparing a parrotfish and an angelfish. And this is a typical method which he used. You noticed he started with a set of rectilinear coordinates on the left and then tried to figure out how to distort them so as to match the shape of the other closely related fish. And these are his words. Let us deform its rectilinear coordinates for the parrotfish into a system of approximately coaxial circles. Then filling in the new system, we obtain a very good outline of an allied fish of the genus Pomacanthus. This is just a color. He made this comment that in this case, the lines he'd drawn on the surface of the Pomacanthus seem to correspond to the ones he drew. I don't know if this has any significance, but it was just an amusing accident as far as I can tell. Here's another similar example, Porcupine-fish and Sunfish. And again, you see, he used the same technique and described it, and I won't bother to read that, but you can see for yourself that it's very much an ad hoc construction, just judging things by eye and trying to see what kind of distortion you have to make to transform one shape into another. And he applied this to many different kinds of species. Here's an example of 3 different marine Crustacea. And again, in the last case, you see that a large eye has suddenly appeared. He made an enormous deformation around that part, but he claims that with this change of coordinates or deformation, you get a fairly clear picture of the relationship between between the 3 species. Now here is his comparison of a human skull and a chimpanzee skull, and I'll especially want to talk about this example. And also he compared a baboon skull. So again, you notice his trademark method of putting rectilinear coordinates on one and then trying to deform them so it matches the other. And he made a very interesting comment here. The empirical coordinates which I have sketched in for the chimpanzee as a conformal transformation of the Cartesian coordinates of the human skull look as if they might find their place in an equipotential elliptic field. Now, I find this totally amazing that a biologist 90 years ago knew what a conformal transformation was and could ask sensible questions about it. I've shown the similar deformation in the case of the baboon, and it is obvious that the transformation is of precisely the same order as that for the chimpanzee and differs only in increased intensity or degree of deformation. So what I want to spend most of my time is talking about this example, in particular this suggestion that a conformal transformation may be appropriate. So the question I want to ask is this: to what extent is it true that individuals of closely related species can be transformed one into the other by a conformal transformation, which carries every significant feature of one into the corresponding feature of the other? Well, that's the question in biology. Let me now make an excursion into mathematics and give a brief, very elementary course about conformal transformations. I'm sure this is familiar to most of you, but the first point is that he was looking at two-dimensional pictures, but of course bodies are not two-dimensional. If there's any sensible theory, it has to be a theory which will work in 3 dimensions. And conformal transformations, 3 dimensions are much more restricted. They don't, instead of the whole field of complex function theory, you have just a finite dimensional Lie group of possible transformations. So this is Liouville's theorem that a conformal transformation of any region in 3 space can be extended uniquely to a conformal transformation from the sphere obtained by adding a point at infinity. So how can you test empirically whether some given transformation is conformal? There's a very simple test which involves just looking at a finite number of points at a time, and that's the distance cross ratio. So suppose you're given 4 points in any Euclidean space. And notice I've labeled 2 of the edges of this tetrahedron with pluses and 2 opposite edges with minuses. And the cross ratio I want to look at is the product of the distances associated with the plus signs divided by the product of the distances associated with the minus signs. So this is a simple invariant. If you can, given any 4 points, if you can measure the distances, you can compute this number. And it, of course, extends beautifully as you let S tend to infinity. If S tends to infinity, then this, let's see, how does this work? No. There it is. If S tends to infinity, then this right-hand quotient tends to +1, so you just get P minus the distance from P to R divided by the distance from Q to R. So there's, as a corollary, a very easy lemma. If you have a transformation which fixes the point at infinity and preserves these distance cross ratios, then it must be a similarity transformation, simply the Euclidean motion followed by a scale change, multiplying all distances by a fixed constant. Because you see, if this quantity, the ratio of the lengths associated with the two edges of a triangle is preserved, you see that the vertices of any triangle map to the vertices of a similar triangle, and it's easy to join any two triangles by other triangles, so that you see that you just get all distances are multiplied by a constant, a positive constant. Well, some examples. R2 we can identify with the complex numbers, and then this distance cross ratio is just the absolute value of the classical cross ratio, so it's a very familiar invariant. Here's an example of two dimensions. Suppose we take a rectangle and put plus signs on the vertical edges and minus signs on the other edges. Then we see that the distance cross ratio is just the square of the ratio of height to width. So again, this is familiar thing to do. Now, of course, the beautiful part about cross ratios is that they are preserved by inversion, and the proof goes over easily to the n-dimensional case using these distance cross ratios. The point that it looks at first a little hard to prove this identity, since it involves 4 arbitrary vectors. But in fact, you can easily reduce it to an identity involving only 2 arbitrary vectors, because once we prove this last identity, you see that when you form the cross ratio, oh, sorry, I meant to do, where is this thing? If we form this cross ratio, all of these terms correspond exactly to the terms on the right, and the other terms, we just get the product of the norms of P, Q, R, and S, both in the numerator and denominator, so they cancel out. So equation 1 follows trivially from equation 2. And to prove 2, just first look at the 2-dimensional case. The inversion is just mapping z to 1 over z bar, and it's an easy computation to show that this identity is satisfied for if z star is 1 over z bar. But then any 2 vectors in Rn are contained in a copy of R2, so this proof for the 2-dimensional case immediately proves the n-dimensional case. Sorry, my thing seems to have gone off the bottom, but you can fill in for yourself. Well, this proves equation 2 and equation 1 follows. Okay, now we can make given all this, we can have a very simple presentation of the group of conformal transformations in any dimension. This definition works even in dimension 1, where conformality doesn't make any sense. We just define the Möbius group in dimension n to be the group of all transformations of Rn with a point at infinity, which preserve these distance cross ratios. Well, it's easy to check that this group is generated by inversion together with similarity transformations. This just follows from the 2 lemmas I've proved above. And it has Liouville's property of locality, but in any dimension, because if you have a region in Rn mapping into itself, which preserves these distance cross ratios, then we can easily move the point to infinity, so that a point at infinity maps to itself, And then using the discussion above about similar triangles, the proof is a straightforward exercise. Now, this can also be identified with the group of transformations of the unit sphere in Rn+1. To prove this, you just use an inversion in a boundary point of the sphere to transform the sphere into an n-dimensional plane, and the conclusion follows. And it's a classical theorem that the conformal transformations of a sphere correspond to the group of isometries of the hyperbolic space. If you use one of the standard models of the hyperbolic space is the interior of the region bounded by a sphere, or classically in terms of usual notation for groups, it's the projective orthogonal group for signature n+1, 1. Well, this is all in any dimension. Of course, you get much more geometry if you go to dimension 2 or more. Then the group is conformal, is Möbius if and only if it preserves angles, if and only it's conformal, or if and only if it maps circles and lines to circles and lines, circles or lines. So this is a standard picture that you can compare with the kind of diagrams that Thompson drew, showing a square grid on the left and what happens to it under a conformal transformation. Okay, that's enough for a short reminder of some classical mathematics. Now, back to biology, and remember what the question was. To what extent is it true that individuals of closely related species can be transformed one to the other by a conformal transformation, which carries every significant feature of one into the corresponding feature of the other? Now, this last condition is the catcher, which makes it very hard to test things. You have to know an awful lot about biology and the shapes of the way things are put together to know what the significant features are and how to pinpoint them. So it's easy to compare pictures, but to make a serious study, you would have to know much more about these things. Well, there's one difficulty which is known well before Thompson. This is a comparison of the bones of a small animal and a large animal. And notice that the large animal has much thicker bones. So there's no way you can take a conformal transformation which takes a skinny bone into a thick bone. This is taken from Galileo. But let me overlook that difficulty for the moment and charge ahead. Well, let me emphasize this by just explaining why it's true. If we try to increase dimensions of an animal, then the supporting strength increases like area, so the square of the factor, and the weight increases like volume, so the cube of the stretching factor. So if you take, for example, an elephant and a deer, if you tried to make an elephant-sized deer by a linear change of scale, the legs would be too skinny, it wouldn't be able to support its own weight. So this is certainly a basic problem that we have to take into account. Now, here's another example taken from Thompson. He compared the foot bones, or the extended foot bones for 3 different species: an ox, a sheep, and a giraffe. In each case, he drew a box around them and marked significant points. And here the scale was chosen so that the total length would be the same for each one. He counted this total length as 100. So here are the figures he gave where, so for example, from out of a scale of 100 from bottom to top, the bottom toe bone of an ox is 18 units, and the corresponding thing for a giraffe is only 5 units. I'm sorry to present, I'm going to be presenting a lot of tables like this. I know it's very hard to absorb such things in a lecture, but they are really central to the kind of point I want to make, so I'll hope you'll bear with it. And if any of you are seriously interested, these slides are on my webpage at Stony Brook, so if you want to take a closer look at anything, it will be available there. Well, the point I want to make is, suppose we look at the ratio of CY over OA, so that's the top bone ratio of the length of the top bone to the length of the bottom bone. And for an ox, that's about 3, and for a giraffe, it's about 15, so it's about 5 times as much for a giraffe. So there's a tremendous distortion of the scale. It's not a similarity transformation by any means. But if we look at cross ratios of these points, they're much closer. Now here we have 5 points marked in the vertical scale, so there are 5 different cross ratios we could take, but only 2 of these are independent. And so if we take the cross ratio of the bottom 4 points, we see that it's fairly stable, all between 2 and 3. And the top ratio, the cross distance, well, the ordinary cross ratio between the top 4 points varies a little bit more, but it's nothing like the drastic change we had in the shape. So in some sense, these cross ratios are very roughly preserved. Now, I define cross ratios so the points did not have to be collinear. We can look at any 4 points. So recall that for a rectangle, the distance cross ratio is just the square of the ratio of height to distance. Now, Thompson's figure very carefully gave rectangles outlining these things so that we can easily measure these ratios, and this is what we get. So we find the situation is even worse than might have expected. This cross ratio from ox to distance cross ratio is multiplied by more than 5 if you compare an ox and a giraffe. And this is, in a way, this is just repeating Galileo's point that if you're going to make a thing bigger, you have to make it thicker. Well, this gives us a paradox. Vertical cross ratios don't change very much, but two-dimensional distance cross ratios change a lot. What can we make of this? Let me try a different thing. So the Möbius group in 2 dimensions, or at least the orientation-preserving ones, are just the classical Möbius group of complex variables. It's a 3-point transitive group. So if we take any 3 marked points, we can find a unique conformal transformations, which takes them to 3 other marked points. So here, as marked points, I chose the center of the bottom, the center halfway up, and the center in the top. And this is what we get. Just taking those, I just took the rectangles on the left and found a conformal transformation which mapped these marked points in the right way. Well, so for the ox, I've just copied the rectangle. For the sheep, it's gotten a little bit distorted, but it's not outrageous. But for the giraffe, it's just ridiculous. So something is clearly wrong. Actually, in a sense, this is the opposite of what one would have expected from the Galileo remark. I would expect the giraffe to be much thicker since it's much taller, but, well, that's what I got anyway. Okay, here's a very different example of how things transform under evolution. Suppose we look at the brain of a mouse and the brain of a human. They're closely related in evolutionary terms, but the relatively smooth brain of the mouse has been transformed by a huge expansion of the surface area with much less expansion of the overall size. Well, that certainly is not a conformal transformation, or not a Möbius transformation. But suppose we look only at the surface of the brain and forget the rest of it. Now, paper by Yao and 4 others who are, I think, computer scientists and or biologists showed that that if you make a conformal transformation from the surface of the brain onto a sphere, it appears to be highly stable. They suggest that this can really be used for an effective tool in medical imaging to try to pinpoint areas of the brain and compare them. So this raises the following question. Suppose we consider this expansion of the cerebral cortex, the surface of the brain. If we consider only the two-dimensional surface, is this roughly conformal? Now, and you can ask this question in 2 different contexts. You can ask it during the growth of an individual, as a baby grows up, does the changes in the surface of the brain correspond roughly to a conformal transformation? Or you can ask it between 2 closely related species. And I haven't the vaguest idea about this. Clearly, it would take an awful lot of expertise to make any dent in answering this question, but it seems to me it's an interesting question. Well, so far I've been talking mostly about closely related species, but we can also talk about growth of individuals in any species. So we all know that a human child has a head which is much larger in proportion to its body, so it changes under growth. But we can try to look at a transformation from a child's body to the adult body and ask whether it is roughly conformal. Now, I found it very hard to get any hard data about this question, but I found this in the Russian literature, which is precisely the kind of information I was trying to find. So this is supposed to show the way humans grow from various ages. And here there are 4 marked points: the top of the head, the neck, small of the back, and the bottom of the feet. And this is the Petukhov's table, where the age is given on the left, and the various heights in centimeters. So the height of the head varies from 10.6 centimeters at birth to 25.3 centimeters, and so on. So again, we can compare ratios. For example, the CD over AB, that's the length of the legs divided by the height of the head, and it grows quite a bit. Doesn't quite double, but it grows substantially. On the other hand, the cross ratio of these 4 points remains much more stable. Well, of course, I mean, one would have to have much more in the way of statistics as to how different individuals compare and how typical these ratios are. But anyway, it gives us a clue, something to look at. Here's another question we can ask. Now, if we look at only a very small part of the body, then if a change is going to be conformal, then in the small it should be roughly a similarity transformation. So here you can consider growth of the middle finger, and here are some statistics. So in this case, we find that the ratios are very stable. And so, of course, it follows that the cross ratios are also stable. So this would be a kind of an argument in support of some kind of conformality. Well, so we have this paradox. The cross ratios along lines tend to be preserved, And yet, in the two-dimensional thing, a conformal map can't carry a thin bone to a fat bone. How can we get around that? Well, there's one obvious group which will do this, namely the projective group. So we can ask the question of, is it possible that Thompson asked the wrong question? Should he have asked if the transformation is roughly projective? Now, my first reaction to this possibility was just to discount it totally, because how on earth could evolution manage a projective transformation? I mean, you could imagine that if different body parts grow at different rates, that somehow making them all fit together might lead to a conformal transformation. But what on earth would lead to a projective transformation? So Bill Thurston saw my comment and took it as a real challenge. He could think of all sorts of ways that evolution might manage this, and also reasons why it might be desirable. I won't try to quote his reasons, but certainly it's clear that there's some cases where straight lines should transform to straight lines. If you start with a straight bone, you don't want to change it to a curved bone. Or if you start with a straight tendon, you don't want to change it to a curved tendon. And of course, things which preserve straight lines are precisely the conformal transformations. So the question is, would the projective group fit the data better? Well, there's a caveat here. The projective group is much bigger than the conformal group in the sense that it's higher dimensional. So the Möbius group in dimension 3 has 10 dimensions, the projective group has 15 dimensions, but this doesn't really capture the difference because we're really only interested in changes in shape. So we should ignore the 7 dimensions or the 6 dimensions associated with Euclidean motions and the 1 dimension associated with just changes in size. So after that, we have only 3 free parameters for the Möbius group and 8 for the projective group. Well, if we're trying to match data, clearly an 8-dimensional group gives us a much better shot than a 3-dimensional group. So we can try it, for example, on this Thompson example again. Now, since I have a bigger group, I can use the fact that it's simply 4-transitive, at least if we consider 4 points which are not collinear. So as 4 points, let me pick the center of the bottom and the center of the top and the 2 outside vertices there and there. So we take the unique conformal transformation of the left-hand rectangle, which does the right thing for these 4 points. And in fact, it looks a little bit more plausible. The sheep is less distorted, and even the giraffe isn't distorted. I mean, it's not a very good picture of what the giraffe's leg looks like, but it's not as ridiculous as the last one. Well, suppose I start with Thompson's original example. So here I took his picture of a skull on the left and tried to find a conformal transformation which would bring it as closely to his picture of the chimpanzee below. And what I got is pretty bad. You don't see much resemblance. Now, it may be that I'm not very good at choosing conformal transformations. Perhaps somebody else could do better, but I suspect they couldn't do very much better. The shapes just come out all wrong. The skull has the wrong shape. The jaw has the wrong shape. It's a pretty bad match. Now, so I was hoping maybe if we try the projective transformation, we can do much better because we have more parameters to play with. Well, I think if anything, it came out even worse. And you can see what's wrong here. So if we sorry. If you look at the jaw and the nose and the forehead, they're all roughly in a straight line in the human. And for the chimpanzee, they're far from a straight line. So there's just, whereas in the projective transformation, I have to make them in a straight line. So it's just pretty impossible. So I think all of this is pretty discouraging. So since I seem to have hit a stone wall there, let me skip to another question which may be related, the question of convergent evolution. So it turned out very often in the course of recent biology that making genetic studies of animals which biologists had assumed were very closely related found that they were actually not related at all. For example, looking at Australian birds, they looked like, many of them looked like European birds, and they assumed that they were closely related, but it turned out that all the birds in Australia were essentially relatives of the crow or raven that weren't at all related to European birds. And this same kind of story is played out in many different places. The eye has evolved independently many, many times. Venomous stings have been invented many different times independently. So this is a general problem that it often happens that dissimilar ancestors converge under evolution to descendants which look very much alike. Now, is this simply because there is an optimal shape for, as example, a bird or for a small mammal or whatever, and that if evolution is going to be efficient, it has to lead the same direction? Or is it just that the mechanism of evolution only allows very limited possibilities, so that even though there might be other shapes that would work better, it's hard for evolution to reach them. Evolution has to proceed by certain changes in the genome and small changes, every one of which has to be evolutionarily advantageous. You can't have 1,000 years of things which are useless being preserved. So what is the answer? Now here's one theory by a couple of biologists called Thompson and Rife. They suggested that there was an enormous abstract space they called skeleton space of theoretical possible skeleton configurations. And here they consider not only skeletons of mammals, but also skeletons of arthropods and so on. And their theory was that there's a much smaller subset of efficient configurations which form a topological attractor, they called it. So their theory is that any evolution of any organism, no matter what it starts out as, must eventually lead to this subset of efficient configurations. Well, this is certainly an attractive theory. It's unfortunately a bit vague. So I don't know how one tests it, but it is I guess, a model for the kind of theory that one might want to form. Well, so what's the conclusion of all this? It's certainly true that for a mathematician, conformal transformations are the obvious simplest transformations which can transform shape, enlarging some parts, making others smaller as desired. And it seems plausible that this simplest solution might also be the best in some cases, so that natural selection would naturally choose it. But on the other hand, natural selection doesn't judge by mathematical beauty, it judges what works. So if any deviation from conformality is desirable, clearly the course of evolution will deviate. And in fact, there is an enormous amount of deviation, as you've seen from the illustrations. And that's true whether we work with the conformal group or try to work with a projective group, we found the same problems. So this leads to a paradox, because we seem to find a lot of cases in which cross ratios are roughly preserved. And, well, especially cross ratios along lines, two-dimensional cross ratios didn't seem to work out so well. Well, the things which preserve cross ratios along lines are projective transformations, and we've seen that the projective group doesn't work very well. So what is the explanation? Is this effect real? And if it is real, why does it occur? Well, I can only think of three possible explanations, and I don't like any one of them. So the first is the engineering explanation. Perhaps there's something about transformations which preserve cross ratios which is mechanically desirable. For example, why should the cross ratio of the bone lengths in a giraffe and an ox be so similar? Perhaps there's something about joints with this, bones with this configuration of lengths which is more efficient from an engineering point of view. If that's true, it's quite reasonable that it would be chosen by natural selection, but I'm completely stuck in trying to think of any such reason, well, why it should be mechanically more desirable. But that is an explicit question which could be studied. The second possibility is the control mechanism. The biochemical systems which regulate growth. Perhaps this is one of the central mysteries of biology, exactly how do these mechanisms work? But is it conceivable that they could somehow tend to yield transformations which preserve cross ratios even when other patterns would work just as well? As I said, this is one of the central mysteries of biology. I certainly have no expertise to answer it, but again, it's an interesting question. And finally, there's the third explanation. Maybe it's all just a numerical accident and doesn't mean anything. Well, I don't like this either, because it seems to me there's some evidence in the numbers I've shown you. Well, that's the end of what I have to say. I hope someday somebody will learn more about this. Here's a list of some of the things I've referred to. And as I said, these slides are on my webpage at Stony Brook if any of you want to see anything in more detail.
Stimulating talk with more questions than answers. Maybe some the questions will be open to the floor. There are mics back there, so they'll be handed out.
This may be related to your explanation too, but is it possible there's something about the structure of DNA and the way that DNA changes that would explain the cross-ratio preservation?
Well, this brings me back to Thurston's objection to the fact that I couldn't imagine how evolution would provide projective transformations. I can't imagine how this would be true, and the argument from lack of imagination is a very powerful one. You can prove almost anything. You can prove that relativity is wrong, evolution is wrong, quantum mechanics is wrong. They're all. If you don't have enough imagination, none of them works. So my answer is I can't imagine it.
Okay, yeah, that's better. So my question is, there are in mathematics many studies of, for example, evolution equations. Think with minimal surfaces or motion by fixed mean curvature, things like that, where the model is obtained always through sort of minimum action principle. And it seems to be reasonable, for example, that for surface, at least exterior surfaces, too much surface is not good in a hot climate under the sun. And you can see that in the actual shape of some animal or plants and so on. And so are there studies in this direction to see how these factors and the physics can influence the actual growth and ultimate shape of things?
These are very good questions. I'm glad to add to the questions I can't answer. Yes.
Whether there is any kind of any conjectures, what makes certain shapes say topological, what you call topological attractors. So do they have any opinion why certain skeleton forms are perhaps could act more like a topological attractor than others? Or?
As far as I remember, it's a fairly short paper. I think they just say that some things work better than others. I don't know that they give any description of why some things work better than others.
So there is no mathematics?
There's very little. I think it's a framework. It's a paper which asks very good questions, but I don't think it has very much actual content.
I was worried about the data because you often took measurement on plane figure of things which were three-dimensional.
Yes.
If a movable shape, like a baby will be on four.
Oh, that's a very good question. Yes.
Can you repeat the question?
The question is, how can I compare conformal transformations of animals when most animals are flexible? I mean, if I move my arms, I've changed my conformal shape. So one has to be very careful about what questions to ask. For example, if you're looking at the skull, that's pretty rigid, so there's no problem. But I think in other cases, what he did was to take an animal in its normal resting position. But that's a very, very important difficulty that if we're doing more than comparing shapes of bones or things which are rigid, then we have to be very careful about how to take into account possible motions.
Since Thompson brought up the conformality in the first place, does he actually give examples where he says, where he argues against? Because he might have chosen, does he point out failures? He's an artist in part, obviously, and he's clearly picked up all the favorable things that he saw, and not, has he told you about what doesn't work?
I don't think he makes any claims about things working. He simply asks questions. He says that there are these changes in shape and asks how you can understand them. But certainly this question of conformality was just an offhand remark. He certainly didn't make any big deal about it.
He was a mathematician too?
Oh no, he was a biologist, but he clearly had a strong interest in mathematics.
Maybe I can speak without the microphone. variation in the human skull, and the fact that he chose somebody with a jaw detached, with a sharp chin, makes a big difference in your modeling. Do you have any idea what would change if you chose a different skull?
Well, that's also a clear question. We're just looking at individuals, and you'd have to combine this with a study about variation between different closely related individuals that are not at all closely related. It's a wide open field of questions, but I don't know what are the significant questions to ask. I guess that's the answer. Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess different human beings are different in different parts of the world, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Would this have anything to do with gravity or some kind of electrical fields around the physical Earth? You know, over long periods of time, of course.
I'm not aware of that. It's certainly clearly established that the climate has an enormous influence. So that, especially when skin color, over long periods of time.
I was thinking more of just like a skeleton, you know, the shape of.
Well, even a skeleton, it could make a difference. For example, in a very cold climate, it's probably more efficient to be quite compact and have a small surface area. And in a hot climate, it may be more advantageous to have larger skin that can sweat. Sorry? There are too many questions. One kind of.
One, I guess, minor point is the example you gave. The primates seem to have the evolution in reverse order, and was that consistent, or?
Well, I was simply making use of Darcy Thompson's pictures, and he started with the human with rectilinear coordinates. And then when you distort the picture, you can see what happens to these rectilinear coordinates. I certainly, I should make another point. Of course, humans and chimpanzees and baboons all have had the same evolutionary time to evolve. It's not true in any sense that we evolved from baboons, but we all evolved from some common ancestor, which maybe looked more like a baboon than like a human, but that was just an accident of methodology. It didn't have any meaning.
I may have missed the point, but how many conformal mappings are there? Are there enough to fit any theory you want, or is there only a finite number?
Finite number of what?
Conformal mappings.
Conformal mappings. Well, there are three free parameters. So you're allowed to pick 3 numbers, and if you can adjust those 3 numbers correctly to match the shape, then you're in business. But in general, you can't.
So is there enough that within the accuracy of the statement, you can always find a conformal mapping?
No, not at all.
That's why you struggle.
Pardon?
That's why you couldn't do it most of the time.
Exactly.
I think maybe we should take a break. So we'll have a 5-minute break and then continue with the next talk. And there will be tea at 4 o'clock. And I'm sure that John will be happy to entertain further questions. Thanks again.
Mm-hmm.